Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining. We're just gonna give it a minute till we get some more folks online, reach critical mass. Welcome, everybody. Going to be waiting one more minute. We'll start at 3:01. All righty. We're going to get started. So, welcome everybody. My name is Lauren Janitis, and I am the Vice President of Policy and Programs for the Society of Conservation Biology North America. So, welcome to the second session of the SCBNA Policy webinar series titled The North American Model of Wildlife Conservation: Origins and Purpose. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, and as we gather in this virtual space, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of the indigenous peoples of North America. This land is home to diverse nations who have cared for these lands and waters for countless generations. We recognize that each participant may be joining from different territories, and we invite you to reflect on the indigenous stewards of the lands you are on. We honor their histories, cultures, and enduring contributions to our collective communities. In this acknowledgement, we commit to learning from and supporting Indigenous sovereignty, environmental stewardship, and cultural preservation. Let this be a reminder of our shared responsibility to the land and to the people who have cared for it long before us. Okay, so I do want to just give an overview of who we are at the Society of Conservation Biology North America. So we are a professional society dedicated to the conservation of biodiversity, the promotion of healthy ecosystems, and fostering meaningful human connections with nature. Our mission is to create a platform that connects diverse students and professionals, facilitating the advancement and application of conservation knowledge. We welcome, support, and empower all voices in conservation, contributing to the equitable solutions and inspiring wonder for the natural world. We do encourage you to become a member. Becoming a member today would be great because if you would like to be part of the working group following the end of this webinar series, you have to be a member to do so. So I'll be talking more about that working group later on. You could scan the QR code on your screen to become a member or visit www.scbnorthamerica.org, and we'll be posting that link in the chat for you as well. Okay, so before we dive in, I just want to get some logistics and housekeeping out of the way. So webinars will be recorded and they will be posted to the SCBNA YouTube page, which we're going to post that link in the chat for you all. So I do recommend that you subscribe to our YouTube page because then you'll be notified when new recordings are posted. Also, all resources to our webinars can be found on our Policy Committee resources page, which we'll also post in the chat for you to access as well. If you would like to access the closed captioning button, you could do so by selecting the captioning button at the bottom of your screen. The chat is available for any questions you have. All questions will be moderated by members of the policy committee with the chat function disabled until the question and answer portion of the meeting. Given that there's a potential for discussion of controversial issues, it really is imperative that all attendees share their thoughts, perspectives, and ideas in a respectful manner. We do reserve the right to remove anybody from the meeting due to disruptive behavior. So please be courteous and respectful of others, and remember that we are a community learning together. You could also start your camera if you would like by selecting the video button. And you could also use the reaction button to raise your hand if you have a question during the question and answer portion of our meeting. Okay, so as you're all aware, the Policy Committee of SCBNA is hosting a 5-part webinar series discussing contemporary issues of the U.S. state wildlife agencies. The idea is really to initiate a process to develop a set of guiding principles when the Policy Committee recommends endorsing or not wildlife conservation and management policies, regulations, or actions of state wildlife agencies. We do anticipate in coming months and years an increased number of SCBNA member requests to comment on issues that involve state agencies. So the webinar series will review current agency characteristics, agency reform efforts, the North American model of wildlife conservation, and controversial key issues surrounding purpose, changing public wildlife values, funding, governance, protecting the public wildlife trust, and ethical decision making. We encourage those interested in our webinar series to attend all the sessions, and you have to register for each one to do so. So that link again was posted in the chat. Make sure you go to that link, our policy committee page, and register for each webinar series. Okay, and again, as I mentioned earlier, the working group. So if you are interested in being part of our working group, that is only going to be open to SCBNA members. So that working group will work on devising the guiding principles and help us design future iterations of our series. So please reach out to policy@scbnorthamerica.org if you would like to be part of that working group. An initial meeting of the working group will be organized following the completion of the entire series. So as we embark on this webinar series, please recognize that there's a wide range of opinions and we must be all respectful of each other and consider all those opinions. We would also like to remind everyone that the series will offer both a historical perspective of the North American model for wildlife conservation and with its implementation at the state level, along with more modern perspectives and viewpoints. So this series is meant to be an introduction to our conversation on state level wildlife conservation, and we fully expect for said conversation to expand and include new perspectives moving forward. All right, so now leading into the second part of our webinar series, the North American model of wildlife conservation, origins and purpose. So let me introduce our first speaker. John Organ is the former chief of the USGS Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit program. He currently serves as the professional wildlife scientist at the Massachusetts Fishery and Wildlife Board. He is a past president, honorary member, and fellow of the Wildlife Society, which awarded him the Aldo Leopold Medal in 2020. He also received the George Bird Grinnell Award for Lifetime Contributions by the Wildlife Management Institute and the Meritorious Service Award from the Department of the Interior. He has adjunct professorship appointments at UMass Amherst, Michigan State University, Virginia Tech, and Universidad Andres Bello in Santiago, Chile. His talk is titled The North American Model of Wildlife Conservation, Origins and Purpose. Welcome, John. Happy to have you. And next we will have Michael Nelson. Michael Nelson is a professor of environmental ethics and philosophy and the director of the Center for the Future of Forest and Society in the College of Forestry at the Oregon State University. From 2012 to 2022, he held the Ruth H. Spaniel Chair of Renewable Resources and served as a lead principal investigator for the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest Long-Term Ecological Research Program, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. He is the author or editor of 4 books and approximately 250 professional and popular articles on a wide variety of topics and drawing upon physiological, ethical, social science, history, wildlife ecology, and creative practice. His talk is titled The North American Model of Conservation Calls for Change. Welcome, Michael. We're happy to have you. And finally, I wanted to introduce Bernie Traversari. He is our Director of Operations and Programs for SCBNA North America, and he's going to be our moderator today. Bernie's background includes research in developmental ecology and amphibian conservation and positions in nonprofit leadership, community outreach, and science education. Before he joined us, Bernie served as the Director of Science Outreach at Edgewood College in Madison, Wisconsin, where he led the development and implementation of community-based science education programs for underrepresented communities across the state. He is also board vice president of the Urban Learning Collaborative, a Milwaukee-based nonprofit aimed at training the next generation of K-12 educators. Bernie is passionate about connecting scientists with community leaders, grassroots organizations, and students of all ages through his role at SCBNA, all in an effort to protect our natural world. Hi, Bernie. Thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open the floor to John.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm sitting here on ancestral lands of peoples from the Algonquin Nation, in particular the Massasoits. And I'm here about a few miles south of what's known as the Mohawk Trail, where the Mohicans would come from the west to access fishing grounds. And there was a treaty among different indigenous nations that allowed for peaceful use of these grounds. I'm going to stop my video at this point and share screen. So bear with me as I try to get the proper. Okay, did that work?
It did.
Wow. Well, hopefully the rest will go as smooth. Well, again, thank you for inviting me here for this talk. But I'm going to be frank with you. This is a topic that honestly I'm tired of talking about, because the concept of the North American model is taken on a life of its own, largely due to narratives that have arisen around it, that from those that either think that it came down from the mountain carved in stone, or those that want to weaponize it against with certain agendas. So it's often been transmogrified through a number of narratives that so hopefully, I will just cut to the chase here and give you background on what this is and how it originated. All right. Did the screen move to the next slide? I can't see. Okay. All right.
No.
Let's try this here. Okay. Did that work?
Nope. Still the first line.
Oh, no. Now we do have some technical difficulties. All right. All right. That probably did it.
It worked. Yep.
All right, good. Okay, so the North American model of wildlife conservation is a concept that was first developed by Valerius Geist, who was professor emeritus of environmental science at the University of Calgary and an eminent wildlife biologist. Geist was born in the Ukraine, and he lived under two totalitarian regimes before emigrating to Canada as a young man. His PhD research on mountain sheep at the University of British Columbia under Ian McTaggart-Cowan resulted in a classic book that won the Wildlife Society's Book of the Year award in 1971. Having experienced how wildlife issues were governed under different regimes around the world, he observed that the United States and Canada had legal and policy initiatives that in combination made wildlife conservation in North America unique. He began to articulate these principles or tenets, calling them a model or example. In collaboration with Shane Mahoney and myself, 7 legal and policy tenets were first published in 2001 as the North American model of wildlife conservation. It's important to recognize that Geist didn't think his way to this compilation because he was tasked by a government authority to write a policy document or to draft a piece of legislation, nor was it simply because of academic fervor or reflection. He developed this description because he was challenged by conflicting philosophies to prove that we actually had some kind of a system in North America to actively and purposefully conserve and manage our wildlife resources. At that time, there was a rising movement of individuals and agencies aggressively advocating for private ownership of wildlife across this continent. While this advocacy proffered many dimensions, what became most identifiable for the general public was the concept of game ranching. This movement in favor of essentially private capture of public wildlife for profit was strong enough that Dr. Geist's opposition to it spurred numerous threats on his life. Under police surveillance and protection, he continued to advocate for public wildlife ownership and against privatization, which he saw as leading inevitably to various maladies for wildlife, including a near certain emergence of novel diseases. He certainly was correct in that prediction, as we recognize now in the world of chronic wasting disease. And that, colleagues, is the historical backdrop to the set of principles that we're going to talk about here today. And for those really interested in fully understanding the basis for this concept, I would encourage you to look at these publications to get, a clearer perspective. So as wildlife conservation emerged in America, North America, distinct form developed. These 7 components or tenets or principles are not all unique to North America, but their collective association is. I want to emphasize, and I'll probably state this more than once, the model is not intended to be prescriptive. The term model is really intended to mean an example. Its purpose was not to outline every conservation strategy and approach, only highlight those underpinnings that are based in law, policy, or treaty that collectively make North American conservation unique. And at this point, I think it's good to just reflect on certain key precepts to North American wildlife conservation. Wildlife has value when it's alive. Its uncontrolled use leading to decline or extinction is unacceptable. And wildlife is a public resource. Governments conserve for current and future generations. These are the 7 tenets of the North American model. I'll describe each of these in greater detail, but again, it's important to note that these are not intended to represent the entire suite of conservation approaches in North America. These represent those with broad-based underlying legal and policy foundations that collectively make North American wildlife conservation unique and distinct from other forms worldwide. The model's not game-centric or focused on hunting, but these tenets have each been applied more so to game species, principally because that is where the bulk of conservation funding, particularly at the state level, has been directed towards. Recently, greater emphasis has been placed on applying these principles to other taxa, such as herpetofauna. I believe an achievement of this century will be application as appropriate of these principles to all taxa. So to start, wildlife as public trust resources is really the keystone of the model. The public trust doctrine, in fact, is a U.S. Supreme Court ruling from 1842. The case that came before Chief Justice Roger Taney, Martin v. Waddell, involved the landowner's claim to rights over oyster beds near the waterline of his property on the Raritan River in New Jersey. The landowner claimed exclusive right to the fishery based on the grant of land to his ancestors in the 1660s by King Charles II of England. In researching the legal basis for such a claim, Taney went back to the Magna Carta to see whether the king had the power to convey such a right. The Magna Carta, in turn, had drawn from ancient Roman law. first articulated in the 2nd century AD under the Emperor Gaius, and first written in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. Many scholars believe the concept of common ownership of wild things dates back to ancient Greek Hellenic law. Indeed, I think it's likely that the first humans held the notions that wild things could be owned by no one. What Tawney discovered is that under English common law, there are special kinds of property. These are held in trust by the king for the benefit of his subjects, not for his personal use. The king, in this sense, is a trustee, owning property for others and having special responsibilities that come with such trust. Under Roman law, trustee status was not defined, but the English conveyed this responsibility to the king. Now, much of the current United States, particularly in the West, was derived from Spanish land grants. So it's useful to see how ownership of wild resources was addressed. Spanish and Mexican land grants placed ownership of wild resources in the trusteeship of the territorial governor. In America, the 13 original colonies were under English law, and the king was trustee. After independence, there was no king, and trusteeship was not defined. Chief Justice Tawney, a staunch states' rights advocate, placed trusteeship in the individual states in his landmark decision in Martin v. Waddell, known as the Public Trust Doctrine. In so doing, he declined the landowner's claim to exclusive rights to the oyster fishery. And I'd like to just make a note on Tawney. Tawney was frankly hated by Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's three heroes were George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and John Marshall. John Marshall was the Chief Justice who preceded Tawney and is largely considered to be the greatest Chief Justice of all time. He was present in the signing of the Constitution, and he helped define the role of the federal government in its role via the Constitution. It's not surprising that Tawney granted ownership status to the states, but he did offer a caveat. He stated that the federal government could assert ownership if the Constitution provided such powers. 3 clauses of the U.S. Constitution allow for federal trusteeship of wildlife resources: Commerce Clause, the Property Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. Commerce Clause gives the federal government authority to regulate interstate commerce, and is the legal foundation for the Lacey Act, the most important anti-poaching law in the United States, and also provides legal authority in part for the Endangered Species Act. Property Clause gives the federal government ownership of resources on federal lands. This clause is broadly written, and federal authority over wildlife in federal lands continues to be contested by many states. The Supremacy Clause mandates that federal treaties are supreme law of the land. The 1916 Migratory Bird Treaty between the United States and Great Britain on behalf of Canada became the constitutional grounding for the 1918 Migratory Bird Act. This federal authority was contested in a 1920 Supreme Court case titled Missouri versus Ray P. Holland. Ray P. Holland was a federal game warden who arrested the Attorney General of Missouri for hunting waterfowl outside the federal season framework. This test case affirmed federal authority over migratory birds vis-a-vis the 1916 treaty. Likewise, the treaty known as CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, provided a constitutional basis for the Endangered Species Act. Chief Justice Tawney, in his decision, did not explicitly address wildlife, but it was assumed the broad language encompassed it. A subsequent Supreme Court decision in 1896, in the case Geer v. Connecticut, placed wildlife in the public trust. Today, public ownership of wildlife is entrusted to state fish and wildlife agencies as trust managers, with limited federal ownership managed by agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. The preeminent scholar of the public trust doctrine, Joseph Sachs, outlines certain conditions that must be held true for the public trust to be viable. Under trust law, trust resources must be considered property and must be available for the general use by the public, unless conserving the corpus of the trust requires restrictions. This applies to traditional uses such as recreation and fisheries. It also applies to what Sachs defined as natural uses that are peculiar to that resource. Sachs stated that the free availability of such natural uses defines a civilization as one of citizens rather than serfs. Further scholarship has suggested that certain other conditions must prevail in order for the public trust to be viable. The public needs to be aware of their rights, and they must be able to enforce it against mismanagement by the government. Also, it must be consistent with contemporary concerns. The ancient Romans likely could have appreciated this hunter's desire to legally pursue and take the white-tailed buck in the photo. They may not have comprehended our concern to protect the endangered hunter-blue butterfly. Public trust doctrine has not always held up as an impenetrable fortress in case law. In some instances, the courts have ruled in favor of general public interests, such as economic concerns, and not recognized the greater obligation that comes with trusteeship. It raises concern as to whether the public trust doctrine is a judicially enforceable right. The second tenet is the elimination of markets for game, songbirds, and shorebirds. This represented one of the earliest crusades in the wildlife conservation movement of the mid-19th century. The New York Association for the Protection of Game, co-founded by Theodore Roosevelt's uncle Robert, made it his primary duty to pass local laws prohibiting the sale of wildlife and making citizen arrests for violations. Members of the Boone and Crockett Club, particularly co-founder George Bird Grinnell, waged a blistering campaign against market hunting and were responsible for passage of the Lacey Act. Garden clubs, led by women, waged a powerful campaign against market hunting for shorebirds and songbirds used in the millinery trade. What Garrett Harding would later term the tragedy of the commons was in full force, as unregulated hunting for markets was rapidly depleting wildlife. When markets placed value on dead wildlife was produced. Sport hunting, or hunting under conditions of fair play, termed fair chase, placed value on wildlife when alive, and the belief was they would produce live wildlife. The third tenet is allocation of wildlife by law. This represents the fact that wildlife in the US and Canada is not allocated based on markets, birthright, land ownership, or other special privileges. Enactment of laws pertaining to wildlife is a process that's open to public discourse. The fourth tenet is that wildlife can only be killed for a legitimate purpose. For hunting and trapping, laws define what species and under what conditions wildlife can be taken. Wanton waste laws in many states require hunters to utilize the meat. For most other wildlife, laws and regulations specify when and where and what permissions apply to the killing of wildlife. Typically, this involves self-defense and property protection. The fifth tenet is wildlife is considered an international resource. Grounded in international treaty, this tenet recognizes that wildlife can transcend borders, and one nation's actions can impact the other's resources. Examples include the Migratory Bird Treaty in 1916, championed by Canadian C. Gordon Hewitt, among others, and CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. The sixth tenet is science is the proper tool for discharging wildlife policy. Although Leopold articulated this tenet in his classic textbook, Game Management, published in 1933, he referenced this as part of what he termed the Roosevelt Doctrine, reflecting the impact President Theodore Roosevelt had on wildlife conservation. All who have been involved in developing policy recognize that science is only one factor that goes into policy decision making. Policy development is part of the political process and involves consideration of public input, economics, pragmatics, and other factors. A challenge we face is ensuring science does in fact play a role in decision making. However, the thrust of this tenet is that once policy has been established, wildlife professionals will implement, that is, discharge it, using the best available science. That science should incorporate both ecological and social sciences. Social science and wildlife policy has become increasingly important as changes in society have rejected, in many cases, the expert authority model that the wildlife profession was founded on. This model's operating premise is that trained technical elites know what is best for society. Bernard Fernot and Giver Pinchot, both disciples of the Prussian forestry system, were weaned on this concept. Social differentiation in the 1960s and the rise of the cult of the individual, as sociologists termed it, demanded a stronger public voice in decision making. The advent of the discipline of human dimensions of wildlife or conservation social science and its role in providing knowledge to decision makers as the attitudes, basic beliefs, and needs of the beneficiaries of the public trust promise to achieve more durable science-informed decisions in the future. The seventh and final tenet is democracy of hunting. Recall that the purpose of the North American model is to identify those key legal and policy initiatives that collectively distinguish wildlife conservation in the United States and Canada from other forms worldwide. Both Theodore Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold wrote that, quote, democracy is sport, where every citizen had the privilege to hunt, distinguish wildlife conservation in America from that in Europe. So to summarize, wildlife, the model is a compilation of core principles and policies that collectively distinguish North American wildlife conservation. The focus, in my opinion, moving forward should be to really look at what further legal underpinnings do we need to meet the emerging conservation challenges. What we require, I firmly believe, is to commit ourselves to disallowing our discussions in the model to be constrained by a narrow bandwidth of thinking that enables us to talk only about tinkering here and tinkering there with a particular principle or a specific aspect of the model. That's not enough for the conservation crises we're facing in this country and in Canada and around the world with respect to wildlife diversity, to the integrity and connectedness of natural systems, and to the ecological fabric of this planet. This burden is a shared inheritance of all humanity. So in this context, I have to ask, have people, indigenous or otherwise, ever engaged with nature without impact of some kind? Of course not. And naturally, this has always been the case. But as one species, we share in a single ecology. Despite our enormous cultural diversity, indigenous and non-indigenous, we're all human. And we can all make significant mistakes in our engagement with nature, or enjoy tremendous success in our contemplations for a better way forward. With that, I will try to stop sharing my screen. Let me see if I can do this. Stop share.
Thank you, John. And I see, Michael, that you have put up your presentation.
Yeah.
Awesome. Then we
All
can
right. Okay, everything's working well. That's great. Well, a big thanks to the organizers for allowing me the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. I'm here in Corvallis, Oregon. It's the ancestral homelands of the Kalapuya people. So along with my colleagues, I wrote what was, I think, one of the first critiques of the North American model back in 2011. We wrote, advance. We wrote another one in 2017, and we wrote an independent report just a couple of years ago, and we currently have a piece in review. So I'll draw upon that work in the first part of my comments to summarize some of our critique of the North American model. But I do want to make it clear that the North American model is by no means anything close to a focus of my work. I don't follow this conversation with a lot of regularity. I'm not part of conversations about the North American model. It occasionally comes into purview. And my sense is that the things that I and colleagues have written about the North American model have simply been ignored. In fact, I think this is the very first time I've actually ever been invited into a conversation about the North American model. So thanks for that. I'll also say that while I don't mind playing the role of the critic, I am, after all, a professional philosopher. What I much prefer are exercises of imagination and creativity about what conservation could be and what it desperately needs to become in light of the future that we face. So I'll spend the second part of my time trying to articulate some of the elements of a vision for the future of conservation. I think it can be safely argued that the campaign to promote the North American model has been incredibly successful. Whatever we might think of its content, its promotion has been remarkable. It's not my job here, however, to assess whether this campaign has been successful. My job is to ask whether this campaign should be successful. Is the North American model an appropriate vision of conservation? And my answer will be no, it's not. And I'm going to divide my critique into two parts, a historical part and an ethical part. So the word model is interesting. It's an interesting word with a variety of meanings. On the one hand, it can be used in a purely descriptive sense, describing how something works or how it worked. Think about an ecological model, an attempt to describe how some system or part of a system functions. Proponents of the North American model very, very clearly employ model in this sense as a historical description of how conservation or the conservation of wildlife, sometimes these are conflated, worked quite descriptively. They begin at a certain point in North American history when things were grim for wildlife, and then attempt to explain how sport or recreational hunters and hunting beginning in the late 1880s ultimately saved North American wildlife from the forces working to bring ruin upon it. Our critique of their account of history, of conservation history, is essentially that it's inaccurate. And it's inaccurate because it's incomplete and overly singular. According to historians like Thomas Dunlap and Carolyn Merchant, among others, it was really a wide variety of nature enthusiasts who worked to save North American wildlife, protect nature, and support conservation. And it was arguably important environmental legislation like the ESA, the Wilderness Act, and the Clean Air and Water Acts, and parallel acts in Canada that were also important components of conservation in North America. Dunlap even suggests that while hunters certainly worked to protect wildlife thought to be game species, they also sometimes actively worked against the conservation of some non-game species, like certain predators, and of course, some still do. The historical narrative of the North American model largely leaves out other critical players in the history of conservation, and especially women and other minoritized groups who played important roles in conservation. It is, we suggest, a highly selective and ultimately inaccurate accounting of history. Our current paper that we have in review also argues that even the North America model's own history of itself is somewhat suspicious. It's often said, and I confess that I have repeated this claim myself, that the first articulation of the principles of the North American model was put down by Val Geist and colleagues in 2001. So in our paper, we demonstrate that while the use of the phrase or the label North American model or North American model of wildlife conservation was first used in 2001, the basic principles of 2001 are relatively minor adaptations of ideas first articulated by Aldo Leopold in his book Game Management, published 92 years ago in 1933. So this raises the question of whether principles articulated nearly 100 years ago and about the management of game would serve as the foundation for a broader conservation philosophy in the face of climate change, the sixth great extinction, and a world facing challenges that were quite unimaginable in 1933. So our current paper also challenges the historical narrative of the success of the North American model. Proponents of the North American model have claimed that it is, quote, the world's most successful system of policies and laws designed to restore and protect fish, wildlife, and habitats, end quote. Many scientific papers have documented that this claim is simply not true. Though some game species saw notable increases across North America during the 20th century, the overall well-being of North American biodiversity is at a historic low, with dramatic declines across many taxa. Rodriguez et al. In 2014 pointed out that more than half of the global deterioration in conservation status of birds, mammals, and amphibians was concentrated in just 8 of 195 countries, including the US and Mexico. Therefore, contrary to the claims of some of its proponents, the North American model cannot be a reason why the US or North America leads the world in wildlife conservation, because we do not lead the world in wildlife conservation. As such, appeals by advocacy and professional groups and others to adhere to the principles of the North American model are effectively appeals to a tradition that failed wildlife and conservation in the past. And finally, so what? Even if it were an accurate account of history, it is illogical. Literally, it is to commit a logical fallacy to move from the is of history to a sense of what ought to be in the future. That is, the second sense of the word model is normative, congratulatory, and prescriptive. It is to suggest that the principles of the North American model ought to be the principles of conservation guiding us into the future. Even though proponents of the North American model have said that, quote, the model was never intended to be prescriptive, end quote, when proponents of the North American model describe it as, quote, the world's most successful or is probably the greatest environmental achievement of the 20th century and maybe one of the greatest achievements of North American culture, end quote, take that, Simpsons, or when advocacy groups use it as a tool to challenge federal and tribal authority, Herrera v. Wyoming, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish v. Department of Interior, or when advocacy groups attempt to use the North American model to justify the removal of federal protections from wolves and transfer authority over wolves from federal agencies to states, they are very clearly employing the North American model in a prescriptive sense. The North American model's tenets themselves are loaded with normativity. We ought to only kill for legitimate purposes. We ought to employ science in decision-making. Finally, if the North American model is only a description of history, why are we here today? Why did you invite me? I'm not a historian and you're not a history group. So assuming that the North American model is in fact prescriptive, is being forwarded as a model for conservation into the future, we can evaluate whether or not it ought to be. I've already said that for me, the answer to that question is no, but I want to be really careful here. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that we shouldn't embrace science as important for conservation, or that we don't need to guard against the commercialization of nature, or that we shouldn't rely on the rule of law or other tenets that I'm not suggesting the other tenets of the North American model are invalid. But honestly, to say those things is to say almost nothing. And here's my main concern about conservation as it is at this moment in time, and it is as it is articulated in the North American model. It asks so little of us at a time when so much is needed. It contains no real moral vision that I can see. It is, in fact, morally vacuous, and certainly no moral vision up to the work and the world before us. To paraphrase Aldo Leopold, the world is asking for, pleading for bread, and we're handing out stones here. Honestly, I can't believe we're still talking about this. I can't believe that as the world of nature burns, and not that world alone, we are frittering energy in this way. It's a distraction that serves precisely those forces working to bring the ruin we are now experiencing. And I'm sorry if I sound cranky, but it is because I am cranky. I am beyond cranky. The world is asking something so much more from us at this moment in time. So fundamentally, I believe that we are in the mess we are in because we continue to embody and employ the basic ideology of the dominant and rapacious Western worldview. We continue to believe and to build into our institutions and practices a set of assumptions that sit at the core of our ideas about ourselves, our ideas about the non-human world, and our ideas about how we ought to relate to the non-human world. We continue to enact, number one, materialism, the idea that the universe is dead. We humans, of course, have spirit, imagination, soul, intention, consciousness. That sets us apart from machines and rocks and, well, also rivers and cedar trees and hummingbirds as well, all dead stuff. We continue to enact dualism, the belief that there's a wide gulf that separates humans from all lesser beings. We are separate and we are special, we believe. Through our exalted minds, we can understand and therefore manage nature and turn it into our own singular purpose of endless progress. And finally, and as a result of those two things, we continue to enact anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are the source of all value, and that the only value of the natural world is in its usefulness to us. But at the same time that this is happening, and maybe more than a coincidence, an exciting new worldview seems to be emerging, bubbling up, and I think from many sources. I see it in my students every day. Think again about the anthropocentrism, dualism, and materialism, those cornerstones of the Western worldview. This emerging worldview has, as a few core concepts, very different ideas about nature, human nature, and what is an appropriate relationship between humans and nature. That is, it is grounded in a different set of philosophical concepts. It is an emerging earth ethos. It is, one, not materialistic. It does not endorse the idea that while humans are imbued with minds, spirits, or consciousness, that the rest of the world is purely matter in motion, and therefore predictable, and therefore quantifiable, and therefore reducible, and therefore controllable. Two, it rejects dualism in many forms. It rejects the idea that humans are somehow and for some reason separate from, different from, in kind from the rest of the world, rejecting in turn the idea that the rest of the world should or even can be put to use only for human purposes. And finally, and as a natural extension of one and two, it is ethically non-anthropocentric. It flatly denies and even finds repulsive, gross, the idea that only humans are the source of all value, that only humans matter. Instead, it begins with the assumption that the world and everything in the world matters, that humans are part and parcel of a blooming, beautiful, living, life-graced world. I'll leave it to you to decide where the North American model fits into these two alternatives. But the core idea is this. If I believed the principles of this emerging Earth ethos, How would I think about conservation and therefore design conservation practices in radically different ways? The dogged and perhaps dogmatic promotion that we sometimes see of the North American model, the exclusion of voices of dissent, the persistent control over the narrative of North American wildlife history, all of these things betray a kind of stasis or calcification of thinking that will not serve us in the future. Even the rhetoric and the metaphors used to express the North American model betray a sense of permanence that is incongruent with the dynamic context that we do and certainly will confront. The tenets are called pillars, seven sisters, the foundation for wildlife conservation, fundamental policies that have endured the test of time, and bedrock. I don't think we need the 10 commandments of conservation or even seven. We need to rethink the very beliefs about the meaning and the role of humans in the world and our broken relationship with that world. Any principles or tenets or whatever need to flow from a new vision of ourselves and our world. And we need fluidity in our thinking and institutions. We need to become like Forsythia. So I'm going to end my presentation with a poem from Jared Anderson. As Forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is Forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, and an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for stone towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your presentation, and thank you again, John, for yours as well. Well, now we move on to the Q&A portion of our session. I will make the chat available for everyone so that you can share your questions for our two speakers. I will be moderating the Q&A as insofar as I'll be going through questions as they come in through the chat, or asking people to just share their question. If you raise your hand or if you unmute yourself, you can do so as well. We have approximately 35 to 40 minutes for any questions you may have. So this is a space for you all to just join in. Jen, I can see you raise your hand, so please feel free to ask your question.
Hi, thanks. Sorry. Michael, does the indigenization of the North American model alleviate some of the concerns that you've raised in your presentation and in your thought process?
I think it depends on what that means. So if by indigenizing the North American model, yeah, I'm not sure exactly I know what that means, but if what that means is that you're founding it upon a different philosophical foundation, indigenous knowledge, which is not just bits of information, it's also metaphysics and ethics. You're providing it a foundation, and I think that totally resonates with the foundation that I'm suggesting. Indigenous knowledge is just one way to articulate that different ethical foundation. But I'm not sure what that does to the North American model. I'm not sure if it, yeah, I don't know what that does. I don't know if it fixes it or makes it irrelevant or what.
I think it evolves it, and I'd welcome someone better than me to speak to it more in detail, but it certainly builds in a reciprocal relationship with the land in a way that perhaps the current model had not.
And I will jump in and just mention that we will be covering that specific topic in a future webinar, so it's good that folks are bringing it up. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Michael. Stephanie.
Hi, thank you to you both for your presentations. I think it's kind of an interesting dichotomy to think about kind of the history as it's presented, the purpose, and then this kind of reaction to that. I guess for somebody who likes to approach conservation science from like a pragmatic lens, does it make sense for all of North America to have a single model? Is that the scale that we should be defining our kind of policy platform for how conservation is individually implemented? And there's, details that I can add to this about how place-based conservation, community-based conservation has been shown to be really effective, and it takes into account all of the details of the location. I guess I'm kind of just more broadly asking, does a more North American model, is that the right scale that we should be thinking about conservation?
And I'm thinking this is a question for both of you, John, Michael.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. Again, I think maybe your question implies more into what the model is than what it really is. Again, it's a historical perspective on what some of the grounding was that allowed Geist and others to take a stand against the privatization and commercialization of wildlife. It's not a comprehensive prescription for conservation in North America. There are many varieties of conservation at different levels, at different jurisdictional levels, at different organizational levels. So this, again, the purpose of this was really quite narrow. And narratives that have developed around this have, created, I guess, an image that it really is more than it is. And I agree with Michael. I'm sick of talking about it. I think we need to move on, and we need to focus on what the needs are, legal and policy tools that we need to address what the current and emerging challenges are. And I also like to just comment on the last person who talked about indigenous knowledge. Yeah, and moving forward, if we don't incorporate indigenous knowledge, we're making a huge mistake. This was I think a tragedy of our early conservationists. They may have incorporated indigenous knowledge for all we know, and that they didn't even realize it because of what was learned from indigenous peoples on this continent, but it certainly wasn't explicit. And in North America, as we all know, we pushed our indigenous peoples into reserves, we killed them off, and we've suffered because that culture is not permeated into our broader culture, unlike other countries, like Peru, for example, where I do a lot of work, where I see their indigenous culture everywhere in their society. And it's not that the Spanish were great people as colonizers, they were horrible, but their purposes were different, and somehow it allowed that culture to stay present in their society.
Yeah, it's a great question, Stephanie. I think you're asking a question about, the one and the many. So there are many things. So does it make sense to think of all those things tied together in some way? I think it depends on how general we're talking about. What I'm talking about really are philosophical underpinnings that then explain why are we doing this? Why are we behaving this way? What's the purpose of conservation? That, if you can articulate that in these general terms, that can apply in infinite different ways on the ground. But without some kind of common expression of a purpose, a meaning, an ethic, I think what you have is just a collection of things. And there are things that we try to tie together with awkward words like sustainability or resilience. And then we get frustrated with those words and we go in search of other words. And partly that's because we're not attending to philosophy, to the philosophical foundation. I hate to be such a philosopher, but I mean that's what I see is this lack of conversation at that at that very fundamental level.
That actually, I think, is a good segue into one of the questions in the chat, and then we'll go back to some of the folks that are raising their hand. So again, for both of you, what structural and cultural impediments do you see in creating a vision for wildlife and biodiversity that is more representative of a broader diversity of viewpoints and the needs required for a healthier, more resilient planet? Like, as we're thinking of what the model or what the strategy needs to encompass, what are some barriers there?
I guess I would say one of the challenges of being within the dominant Western worldview is you don't see it. If you're not of the dominant Western worldview, you see it. You see the assumptions that people make. But if you're not, you don't see it. So you just assume that what we think about ourselves, the world, the relationship between the worlds is just the way it is. But it's not just the way it is. It's a choice, and it was a choice made during the Renaissance. We chose some ideas about human nature and the relationship between nature, and we've rejected others. So one of the impediments is vision, is just seeing that we are enacting ideas over and over and over again, and being able to see that clearly. And then I think the next step is, and in some ways that's the easy part. The next step is pretty radical self-reflection. We have to ask ourselves hard questions, and we're not terribly good at that. We're not terribly good at wondering, and this is part of human nature. There's, confidence bias. We tend to, want to think we've got it nailed somehow. It's uncomfortable to engage in critical self-reflection of the kind that I'm suggesting. But I think that unless you tear those things down, you just simply won't rebuild. You'll just rebuild the same structure over and over and over and paint it a different color or something like that. So again, a philosopher answer. Sorry.
I think there certainly are a lot of impediments, and many of them are cultural. We have difficulty sometimes thinking outside of the box that we're in. We go to the same old tools, if you will. There's some of the cultural barriers, I would say, are religion, Judeo-Christian views of the world in nature. There's political impediments. And one of the things that really troubles me is that when it comes to national politics, and even oftentimes local and state politics, where is wildlife conservation and biodiversity in the discussion? It's nowhere. Yet, if in surveys of the American public, they value wildlife, biodiversity, but when it comes to making choices, it's often economics and self-interest. And how can we help people to realize that biodiversity, that healthy nature is important for people, important for mental health of people, as psychologists and neuroscientists have demonstrated. We've got, I think, a barrier in communication as well as a barrier in investigation and in research, and to be able to really identify the importance of nature and to communicate that so that we can change behavior in our public.
I'll attempt to summarize a couple of questions into one concise one, and then move on to some of the folks that are raising their hand. So this comes mostly from a practicality angle, right? So Michael, you've mentioned a couple of philosophical questions, and one could say academical questions in terms of how we think about the model and how we do things in conservation. But what are some recommendations based on your individual presentations and your thoughts as to how to move forward that lawmakers, policymakers should know? We have someone in the chat who's sitting, I think, at a commissioners meeting for Idaho Fish and Game. What do those folks need to know in order to at least attempt to move forward with a different vision of how we do things? And one more thought that I add to that is, I guess it came from the sort of need for a lot of policymakers to have a model to grab onto, right? Or have something concrete to grab onto to do policy and to come up with new policy. So I guess that's where the practicality angle is coming from.
I guess I would say the same thing. I think I think this requires radical examination. They need to know that they're enacting ideas. They need to know that they're enacting concepts. Often these concepts are underappreciated or undertreated. Sometimes they're mistaken. Sometimes they're actually inconsistent with what we know from science. Sometimes they're not, but they're always enacting ideas and concepts. They're always enacting notions of value. They're always enacting ethics. There's no policy that doesn't have a kind of ethical ideology at its core. That's always there, and it's almost always untreated. And I think that that's often what gets us into so much trouble is we're not critically reflective of the ideas that we are invoking and bringing into our policies.
John, anything else you want to add to that? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Sorry. No, I thought the question was directed to Michael, and I think he handled it well.
Perfect. And Marek, am I saying that correctly? I think you had raised your hand for a while.
It's Amaruk, but that's fine. You had a 50-50 chance. I'll answer to hey you. Michael, John, thank you so much for your presentation today. I'm suddenly realizing my question actually has a separate part to it. You know, distinguishing between the fact that state wildlife commissions aren't even generally composed of people that have backgrounds in wildlife biology, ecology, and general science. I don't know how we tackle that, but my concern has long been that the people that are filling positions in state wildlife agencies are going through universities, which are teaching them to think in a certain way and have a certain worldview. And I can't speak for everyone on this webinar. I've certainly been removed from my university training, 3 lifetimes ago. So I don't know what's being taught today. It has long been a concern of mine that if people coming into agency staff positions are coming in thinking that the NAM is it, that's how we're going to manage wildlife, that's how we should manage wildlife, that's how we're going to talk about managing wildlife, then we have a deep problem with the agency positions apart from the problem at the commission level. And I'm wondering if you, speaking, I guess, from your role in academia, Michael, and John, whatever your thoughts on this might be, what is going on in the universities these days in terms of training how people think about wildlife conservation and the world we exist in today? And if how it's being taught isn't going to help us for very long into the future, what are your suggestions for what could be done to change things in academia?
Let me take the first crack at that. I have a foot both in academia and in state wildlife management and 40-year career in federal wildlife conservation. University, my experience with the universities I'm involved with is that the nature of the curricula and the students has changed dramatically. And, the model is by and large not being taught because what's there to taught, except it's maybe in a historical policy perspective of important laws and treaties that were passed. It's not a prescription, at least in the universities I'm involved with it, that's being taught. This is the way you do business. The employees that I see coming into the agency where I'm a commissioner typically have a broader base. Many are interested in in conservation social science, broader biodiversity, and the roles of those people at the say wildlife manager level on the ground is broad based. They're not just focusing on game species, for example. Their daily tasks involve everything from turtle conservation to plant conservation, because that's under the authority of the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, invertebrate conservation, to going into winter black bear dens to document productivity. So it's broad based in what they're doing. Now, the agency that I'm involved with may be unique, maybe progressive, but in terms of the 3 U.S. universities I'm involved with, the model is not being taught. That's not the basis of a curriculum, and nor should it be.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'm trained as a philosopher. I'm a specialist in environmental ethics, but I'm in a college of forestry here at Oregon State University, and it's a college of forestry with a very long history, and it's a pretty brutal history. And I would say we are in the midst of reinventing ourselves in pretty profound ways. And even in the almost 13 years that I've been here, it's become quite a different place. I've been in the departments of fisheries and wildlife too. I was in Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University. And I agree that we don't, I mean, I'd like to say we don't indoctrinate our students. There still is some indoctrination. It is true. There is some still. But it's getting better and better all the time. So, when I was at Michigan State, I taught philosophy of ecology and environmental ethics. Here I teach critical thinking and environmental ethics. And I try to, think of innovative and weird classes that I think will serve the students into the future. I proposed a whole seminar just on the concept of integrity last year. How do you match what you know and what you value with how you live in the world? How do you maintain integrity? So there's lots of really interesting things that are going on. My Center for the Future of Forest and Society, I just hired an artist. He's a designer, and part of it is to help us, to shake us, to get us to think about things in creative and innovative ways. And there's a really great sort of buzz going on. Does that mean our traditional stakeholders don't push back on us? No, they certainly still do sometimes. But interestingly, some of our traditional stakeholders also point out that unless we diversify our base, that doesn't serve anybody. So they're also pushing us at the same time to diversify our base. My experience is that they know that they're going into the future too. And they're thinking that the future is 30 years in the past. They understand what the future looks like, and it doesn't look like the past. So, I try to think of this as we're in this together. We're trying to figure something out. None of us are going to recreate the past. And it feels like that appeal to, a commonality, right? We're all confronting this uncertain future. It seems to be kind of effective in going on. Our students are experiencing things that are really difficult. They're very nihilistic. They don't believe they have a future. And they don't think that's an outrageous thing to say. There's no indication they do. And so they either go to nihilism and it gets really dark, or they go to sort of creativity. They're kind of reinventing relationships and ideas, and it does create this opportunity for some real progressive thinking. Not that I would prescribe that as a way to get to progressive thinking. I think there's probably better, healthier ways to do it. So we're in this really interesting crisis mode. Mental health is a real issue. Climate grief is a serious issue. We are all struggling with it ourselves, and then how to deal it. We're not clinical psychologists. We can give them tools. We can teach them critical thinking. We can give them ways to think through problems, but that's about all we can do right now.
Thank you both. Sarah. I see your hand up.
Thank you so much for the presentations, Michael and John. I really appreciate hearing your perspectives. I'm wondering, I work for Project Coyote in Vermont. I'm their state representative here. And I deal with Fish and Wildlife Board and department that are sometimes seem less than interested in listening to scientific evidence presented to them and scientific data. And I also find that in Vermont, we're running up against a situation where historically we're kind of leaving a time period where folks could really make money off of the land. And we may be leaving that time period later than some other states. But I'm curious from both of your perspectives how to reconcile with departments and commissions that aren't terribly interested in listening to science and also may be very concerned with economic impacts of changing wildlife regulations, how to balance science and economic impacts in some of our more rural states, because I'm aware that some Vermonters are still relying on some forms of hunting for livelihood. So I'm just trying to figure out how to balance some of those things when I present info as someone who's doing this work on the ground. And I'm very interested with both of your different backgrounds and also, like Michael, your philosophy background, just to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Well, it's a interesting question, Sarah. What I found, and I think most would agree, that the legal mandates for public input for boards and commissions that were enacted decades ago are, to say the least, an imperfect way to get public input on regulatory changes or management actions. And it's something that we struggle with in Massachusetts. You know, we're bound by law to have public hearings, and you only get really the advocates, say pro and con, that come to the table, and you don't get the general temper of the public. And we're trying to address that through different mechanisms, listening sessions. We have a social scientist on staff, so we can, do broader surveys to, get attitudes and beliefs and those sorts of things. But it is a challenge to get science on the table, and at least in the board that I'm on. All of the 7 board members, including myself as the scientist on the board, are quite attuned to the science that's put on the table. But I think, how that science is presented is important. And if it's perceived as being, advocacy based, and selective, it may get less attention than something is perceived as coming more from an honest broker. And I think that's a challenge we all face, is ensuring that what we put on the table is, has qualifications to it, and alternatives as well, so that it's really being perceived as coming from an honest broker as opposed to an advocate.
I wish I was an environmental psychologist, because I think in some ways your question is about environmental psychology. It's essentially, how do you, what's a recipe for people to listen to something, whether it be science or something else? I think I know enough about environmental psychology to be a little dangerous. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that as human beings, we have certain biases, and the cognitive biases, and we can deal with them. But some biases that are really important to recognize are things like confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias, right? The tendency to believe information, and if you believe it adheres with what you already believe. And it's not obvious that science by itself can overcome some of that. We just published a paper, a survey of managers, where we demonstrated that even appealing to long-term data versus short-term data doesn't seem to impact confirmation bias. And a little bit of it has to do with the fact that appealing to the facts of the matter, science, is only part of what goes into decision making. The decision making for all of us, not just managers or policymakers, it's only part of it. I think the other thing that one of the frustrations I have sometimes with conversations about the role of science is people like to use that word, they used to like to use the word based. Our decisions should be based in science. And sometimes that word's it's not very helpful by itself, because sometimes what they mean is it should be determined by, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, no policy is determined by science itself. That's not what science is. And then sometimes they mean informed by, or like not inconsistent with science. And so I think even trying to understand the language that we're using and the ideas behind that language is sort of helpful, because we can just pass one another by, not understanding it. The one bit of science, and this goes back to the previous question, that I think is really important for conservation to pay attention to, is one of the things we don't have in social science very much is longitudinal data. We don't get to follow people around very much. That's called stalking, I guess. But one bit of longitudinal data that we have that's critical is that things are changing. Values are changing. Values about the relationship between humans and the natural world are changing, and they're changing profoundly. We are moving from a world where people are comfortable with a deterministic attitude about humans and nature, more toward what colleagues call mutualism, where we're part of a larger community. And most importantly, it's changing generationally. It's changing in young people. So if conservation can't get on board with that, we will be appealing to an ever smaller and smaller contingency. If natural resource programs can't get on board with that, we may disappear. And I think we are. I think we're understanding. I see that as an amazing thing, but it's not something we're going to beat back. It's not something we're going to deny. So that's the one little bit of science I think it's always like churning in my mind, how that change is taking place. And I also just find it incredibly hopeful as well.
Thank you for that. We have enough time for one more question, and I wanted to bring it back to really a comment that was made in the chat. And it says that a key point that seems to be rarely discussed is that the North American model is called the North American model of wildlife conservation, not biodiversity conservation. I think this goes back, Michael, to your point about language and the words we use. We've even named this our policy series on state wildlife conservation, not biodiversity conservation. And yet our next webinar session will talk about how do we define conservation and how do we use the right words or different words to move forward. And so I just wanted to get your closing thoughts on how we can start not only doing things differently, but perhaps shifting the narrative by using different terminology, different words as we move forward.
Yeah, I think so. Some of the words, to me, the values are very clear. So when I say game, that's something that is a means to human ends. When I say management, I think that exists in that same realm, and that's fine. I'm just that the meaning is clear. When I say things like wildlife, I don't know what that means. I mean, I know it means critters. But does it mean the game critters? Does it mean all critters? Does it mean species and ecosystems, or at least species and populations, collectives? If I use the word biodiversity, that's helpful. But again, I would say, okay, we're interested in the preservation of biodiversity. Why? What's the purpose? So, the foundation of your organization actually is very ethically clear, as articulated by Soulé, that biodiversity has intrinsic value. He's very clear about that, and that we're in a crisis, and we need to address it, and that's how we do it. So it's not reductionistic, it's not anthropocentric. Now, has that shifted? I don't know if that's shifted or not. But I think when I think about being careful with language, I think about what are the values, the assumptions that are being built into that language. I also don't think that just switching language around is all that there is, even though I know language betrays concepts and it's really important to attend to. One of the things I see with my students is they get suspicious of language. So, I mean, right now they're rolling their eyes about sustainability because they're just like, sustainability is just a different word for people to keep doing the same crap that they've always been doing. So they get cynical because we haven't defined it in an ethical sense. Why are we interested in sustainability? What do we think is the purpose? What do we think value? What do we think matters in the world? And we're mostly just silent about that. So I'm glad that you're attending to language. I think that's really important because it does matter, but it's also not enough.
Yeah, I think as we move forward, we need to think much more broadly than wildlife. We have to think of conservation writ large because, as we all know, we're part of a biotic community, and we need to think in those terms of that interrelatedness. In terms of the use of wildlife in the concept of the North American model. Again, it goes back to a specific purpose. Over challenges to public ownership of wildlife, as opposed to privatization and commercialization. And in listening to the questions and looking at some of the chat comments, I think that one of the challenges has been that the North American model, as a historical construct for the purpose it was put forth, had become synonymous with state-based wildlife management, which is not appropriate, and so it's been used to really as a surrogate to attack state-based wildlife management. And the concern, I think, many is that the tent is small. And part of the reason, it's not the whole reason certainly, but a big part of the reason is the funding base for state-based wildlife conservation. It's still generated largely by hunters, anglers, and shooters. If RAWA had passed Congress, it would have seen a tremendous influx of funding into state wildlife agencies that I believe would have broadened that tent tremendously. And I'm hopeful that at some point in the future, I don't think with this Congress by any means it's going to happen, but which is really unfortunate. But if we can break that log jam and get broader based funding, I think that will help tremendously because commissioners, board members, they're trustees, and their role, their responsibility is to all citizens, not just those that pay the bills. But unfortunately, because of that limited funding source, that's where a lot of the efforts have been directed towards. We published a paper, Dan Decker, myself, and colleagues published a paper back, I think, in 2016 in Conservation Letters on wildlife governance. And I think if you look at that what we outlined is what we believe the role of those trustees should be, and the information that they should be using to make decisions, and to keep at arm's length from special interests. I'll end it there.
Thank you for those final comments. I believe, John, that the paper you're mentioning is already up on our website, but if not, I will make that available to our attendees if that's of interest to everyone. I believe that gets us to the last part of our webinar session, sorry. I wanted to once again thank John and Michael for taking the time to be here today and to present on this very important topic. I also want to thank everyone for attending and for respectfully sharing your opinions and questions as we asked at the beginning of the session. Before everyone leaves, I wanted to briefly remind you that we have another session taking place as part of this webinar series in 2 weeks. And then in addition to that, it would be very useful to us if you could take a moment to fill out the post-event survey that I have linked in the chat. Or if you want to use your phones, you can also take a picture of this QR code and fill it out as well. This would be really useful to us as we continue to design future iterations of the series and as we work with our working group to see where our work on state wildlife conservation can take us. And with that, I will stop our recording. Thanks again, everyone, for being here.